We're joined now by Editor-in-Chief NDTV Network, Sanjay Pugalia. Sanjay ji, very good morning. It's a very exciting morning here in the studio and for the markets. आप देख रहे हैं 800 पॉइंट गैप अप निफ्टी पर. इसके बाद क्या होगा, प्रॉफिट बुकिंग होगी या नहीं, अगले 2 दिन देखेंगे. लेकिन ये समझने के लिए कि अगर इतनी भारी बहुमत के साथ, इतने नंबर के साथ तीसरा टर्म आ रहा है, what does it mean for government's policy focus?
एग्रेसिव और डिसाइसिव पॉलिसी मेकिंग चलेगी. बहुत सीरियस कंटिन्यूटी रहने वाली है और जो बहुत सारे ऐसे काम हाई ग्रोथ क्रिएट करें जो रुके हुए थे या जिसमें थोड़ा कंसेंसस का या पॉलिटिकल कॉशन का इशू था, वो मुझे लगता है काफी हद तक दूर हो जाएगा, क्योंकि तीसरा टर्म एम्फेटिक मैंडेट सारे रिकॉर्ड तोड़ते हुए ये मौका किसी भी इंडियन प्राइम मिनिस्टर को रेयरली मिलता है. 50 साल के बाद कभी मिलता है. वो मौका इनके पास आया है. नरेंद्र मोदी की जो सरकार बनेगी और उनके पास ये स्पेस है, अब पॉलिटिकल मैंडेट है जिसमें वो हाई रिफॉर्म के लिए, हाई ग्रोथ के लिए जो जरूरी रिफॉर्म है उसको पुश कर सके. लेकिन याद रखिएगा, रिफॉर्म के हमारे डेफिनेशन अलग हैं और एक पॉलिटिकल लीडरशिप के डेफिनेशन अलग होते हैं.
उसी सवाल को आगे लेते हुए हमारी अभी बात हो रही थी कि लैंड जो रूल्स हैं, लेबर रिफॉर्म्स हैं, इज दैट मार्केट एक्सपेक्टेशन, पॉलिटिकल डेफिनेशन में ये बैठते हैं या नहीं?
मार्केट को कितनी तवज्जो दी जाए ये भी नए वाला मैंडेट तय करेगा और मार्केट को नए रूल सीखने पड़ेंगे. बाय द वे, जहां तक लैंड और लेबर का सवाल है, उसमें यह है कि ये सारे स्टेट के सब्जेक्ट हैं. अगर तमन्ना आपको याद हो तो हमारे एनडीटीवी के इंटरव्यू में प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोदी से जब मैंने सवाल पूछा कि रिफॉर्म को आगे कैसे बढ़ाएंगे, तो उनका यही जवाब था कि सेंटर, स्टेट और लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नमेंट तीनों जब तक मिल के जुगलबंदी में काम नहीं करेंगे तब तक बड़ी चीजें नहीं हो पाएंगी. स्टेट के बीच में कंपटीशन होना जरूरी है, थोड़ी अवेयरनेस बढ़ी है और वहां अगर काम तेजी से हो जाए तो ये चीजें ठीक हो सकती हैं. जाहिर है कि लैंड में और लेबर में, दोनों में ये चीजें मैटर करेंगी कि स्टेट वाले भी किस तरीके से रोल प्ले करते हैं. मेरा ये मानना है कि ये सब कोई भी चीजें हर्डल नहीं रहने वाली हैं हाई ग्रोथ ट्रेजेक्टरी के लिए, जो करना जरूरी है उसके लिए.
Well, and if you doubted policy continuity, if you had seen Mr. Sanjay Pugalia's tweet when the PM Modi interview happened, that since policy continuity seems imminent, let's focus on what happens ahead. Let's focus on what could happen ahead with Taimur Baig. He joins in this conversation as well, MD and Chief Economist at DBS Group Research, and heads the markets there as well. Taimur, great having you. Thanks for taking the time out. Assuming that the results pan out the way the exit polls are suggesting, Taimur, what's your sense about what does this hold for India as an economy in terms of policy and continuity, and what could it mean for markets?
Good morning, and I will begin by not assuming that, because I think it's a big leap to say the exit polls are going to be 100% correct. Okay. They have been spectacularly wrong in the past as well, so I will be very careful about taking any strong cue from the exit poll. But having said that, I think we can all safely predict that the incumbent will return to power. But the margin of victory, in my view, the exit polls, we should be very, very careful about taking that at face value. Now, in terms of policy continuity, I think that is what everybody says when there's a re-election. I think that what we need to think about is, if the mandate is stronger than expected, does the government try to do some things that were hard to do in the past? For example, leaning into the states with respect to land reform more than they had in the past? Or do they take this mandate as a mandate to basically do business as usual, which is a court for investment in manufacturing, but at the domestic side, sort of keep on adding momentum to various revenue generating schemes, which hopefully will include disinvestment, something that has lagged in recent years.
Sanjay sir, the next 100 days are becoming very, very crucial, and this is what we've talked about over the last few weeks as well. But before that is the much anticipated budget. What do you think the street should be expecting in the next 100 days in terms of reforms and the budget, more importantly?
I will be careful in using word reform in a very broader sense, because Modi governance, they define reform in a different manner the way we define. As far as you mentioned about 100 days, my guess is, and I think that is an important point to keep in mind, during these 100 days, Are we expecting announcements or action plan? I think there will be bias towards actual execution, commissioning, actioning things rather than a document which only expresses the wish list or desire of what government wants to do. Maybe the work will start before the budget. As far as budget is concerned, never expect budget to be the main political event in Modi regime. A budget is one important exercise that this government does. Beyond budget, before the budget, I am expecting a lot of announcement. And more than an announcement, there will be a very time-bound kind of action plan. And my expectation is that all those things that are required to accelerate growth will be taken care of, be it manufacturing, be it triggering more capex, be it spending on infrastructure, keeping fiscal deficit discipline in mind. All of these things will be taken care of by this government because they have that space available and that mandate available to them.
Taimur, just wanted to get, and I take your point completely that it's not final till the results come out. I also get your point that exit polls have got it wrong in the past. One would counter-argue in 2014 and 2019, these polls underestimated what the margin of victory would be, and their methodology has improved. The question, though, is how much of a push eventually can come from continuity? What can be seen policy-wise in term 3 which moves the needle? Because now the vision which has been placed by Prime Minister Modi ahead of the polls is now India Viksit Bharat, going to a developed nation by 2047. Can that really push things in a very constructive way?
Right. And I think that in terms of having a North Star, a 25-year-old goal to get somewhere, we've seen this in the past. Malaysia, for example, used to have a Vision 2020 plan where the view was that Malaysia would reach developed country status in per capita income by 2020. And that somehow became a guiding post for the government for about a 20-year horizon in terms of promoting industrial policy, in terms of pushing for innovation. I think examples like this tell us both the power of setting a long-term North Star. It also tells us some of the pitfalls that we have seen with countries like Malaysia, where things don't always work out the same way. So what are the things that India would do going forward? And clearly, the geopolitical tailwind for India is sort of unparalleled in history for the nation. The kind of sweet spot it is in right now, where whether it is American or European or Japanese investors finding India very attractive from a geopolitical perspective, as well from a fundamentals perspective, to base a lot of their investment in. So that is key strategy, and I think that is already in place. I don't think we need to see anything new in terms of reforms to do that. It is a question of public-private partnership and the private sector being guided by the public sector in courting foreign direct investment. I would like to think that an administration that is now emboldened by consecutive victories would also take vigorous focus on climate change. We are talking in a week, or rather a couple of months, where we've had repeated record temperatures. The whole country, or a large part of the country, is baking in record heat. The imperative to set, again, a North Star, a 15, 20, 30-year goal to bring the country's environmental situation under sustainability, which also, again, creates huge opportunities for tech innovation, job creation, and investment, I think would be a very nice additional element to the existing plans.
Taimur, one follow-up before I actually have a question for Mr. Pugalia as well, but one follow-up, Taimur. If you look at across the large electoral countries that have gone to elections or will go to elections this year, right? Again, like you said, whether or not the numbers are the same as the exit poll, but because the incumbent party is set to return, India is one country that is showing policy and political stability. How much of a factor does that play in India maintaining the high PE multiples that India has? Should people be worried about these multiples, or should people say that this is warranted because of all that's happening in the country?
Right. I think the multiples reflect expectations of re-election of the incumbent. It reflects continuation of the 6% plus growth, heading further, hopefully, based on both domestic and global tailwind. I think that countries that have steady governance, Indonesia come to mind. We just saw a very successful election there with the first round leading to President Poboyo's election and peaceful handover of power, a similar policy trajectory. And I think investors like that. We will probably see that also in Mexico soon when they have the elections. So there are large countries out there which also are delivering stable governance, re-election, not necessarily leading to policy discontinuity. India is in the same vein. I think the big difference between India and the rest among the large democracies would be that extra growth momentum that we have, which would likely continue going forward. That, to me, is the core of the high multiples that the markets are assigning. And mind you, India has always been a high multiple economy with few exceptions here and there over the last 20, 30 years because underlying growth has been strong, particularly domestic demand, consumer cyclicals, some of the most expensive stocks in the country. That, I think, has rewarded investors despite the very high PEs.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up to this question with Sanjay Pugalia. Sanjay ji, in your interaction with PM Modi as well, you had made it a point to try and figure on what could the next 100, 200, 300-day plan be. To your mind, based on that conversation and your study of what BJP has done in the last 2 terms, where are the policy continuity chances the highest? Because while the markets may think of 1.0, 2.0 and 3.0 as 5-year blocks, the BJP doesn't necessarily think of sectors and policy pushes in 5-year blocks. They may think of it in a much larger block.
True. So I think the acceleration in infrastructure, in poverty alleviation, more focused welfareism, and bringing costs down for doing business, all of these areas are going to be very important area. And as Mr. Baig mentioned, climate change is the real challenge. Any government cannot ignore this, and the kind of public pressure and public desire will be built around. I think India has done pretty well, and they are going to get more aggressive from here on. So I'm expecting very, very large scale actions very, very quickly, actually. They won't result in days and months and maybe a couple of years. But for next 5 years, the work agenda is going to be very, very heavy in terms of all the sectors that are most important, including power or transmission or consumer spaces. I see a lot of push coming from the policymakers.
Taimur, you watch the world from outside. Are you constructive on Indian equity and Indian debt? And we're trying to pick your brains to understand where India sits when an FI looks at us. There are opportunities outside India. There are opportunities in other asset classes, be it Bitcoin, commodities, China, NVIDIA. The list is extensive. If you are constructive India, that's great. If you're not constructive India, what is it going to take for you to turn constructive and overweight on Indian equity and Indian debt at this stage?
Right. I really always prefer, looking at India as investment in the context of a global portfolio manager's perspective. And you're absolutely right. We are right now at an everything rally. Gold to Bitcoin to China stocks, China credit to Indian equities to US equities. Everything has been rallying over the last 4 months. And the nervousness of global investors with respect to geopolitics notwithstanding, we seem to have a few very bright secular tailwinds for the global economy. One is related to new waves of technology, which would cause a new sort of paradigm with respect to investment, job creation, opportunities. And the second is, again, opportunities around green transition, where trillions and trillions of dollars would be invested with very strong return likely for those who enjoy the clean air and the reduced pollution coming from those activities. So clear link between investment and returns in the way we live, the way our productive lives operate are there. And I think that's what energizing global investment sentiment, despite the fact that whether it is in India or the US, interest rates on the high side, public sector debt is rising, and fiscal deficits are still somewhat under the gun in terms of concern. But I think from a portfolio management perspective, whether one wants to invest in relatively high yield emerging market bonds like India, underpinned by a strong rupee, or want to take advantage of the Indian equity markets, which despite having high multiples, seem to have demonstrated gainful returns for investors, I think that case remains undiminished.
Well, Sanjay ji, I'll come to you next. Just a very simple, straightforward question. What are the 3 challenges for the NDA government in the 3rd term, if there are any?
High expectation from this government, because this government comes most likely with a stronger mandate than it had, and the need of speed. And the third thing I would say that the high growth which results into more jobs and equality. These are 3-4 key issues, and of course climate and the efficient governance. These are the 3 or 4 areas where I think are the priority or the challenges or the compelling need to work.
Sanjay ji, one takeaway from the exit polls, if it also finalizes or, converts to the final results, seems to be that what was being offered on the other side was rejected. And I'm talking about the khatakhat promises, 8,500 rupees in every bank account, and very tangible promises, right, for voters. Now, in a traditional sense, one would think Indian voters would really go for this. Freebies है या नहीं, एक बड़ी चर्चा भी हुई. लेकिन अगर इस तरह का रिजल्ट नतीजा निकलता है, तो क्या इसका मतलब है कि इंडियन वोटर को अब इन फ्रीबीज में इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, या जो प्रॉमिस कर रहे थे उन पर भरोसा नहीं है?
तमन्ना लेजीनेस है अपोजिशन पॉलिटिशियंस की, कि वो एक स्टोरी लाइन नहीं ढूंढ पा रहे, वो लैंग्वेज नहीं ढूंढ पा रहे जिससे कि नया इंडियन जो बहुत ही एस्पिरेशनल है उससे बात कर सकें. उसके विजडम को डाउट करना कि आप बहुत ज्यादा पैसा देने के लिए बोल देंगे, कंपटीशन लगा देंगे, ऑक्शन लगा देंगे और उसको वो मान लेगा, ऐसा नहीं है. जहां तक डिलीवरी और प्रोमिसेस का सवाल है, अगर डिसअपॉइंटमेंट है भी, तो भी वो करंट रिजीम के साथ अपने को ज्यादा कंफर्टेबल पाता है, इसीलिए पॉसिबली ऐसा मैंडेट या ऐसा पॉलिटिकल चॉइस उसने किया होगा.
So, इस वक्त the biggest, I think, focus of the market right now, and I'm just going to pull up the implied open again, which is hovering around an 800-point gap up, is what this day is going to look like. So before we continue the conversation further, I'm just going to play out this, I think, viral soundbite of the Prime Minister in that conversation with Sanjay Pugalia, where he talked about कि प्रोग्रामर थक जाएंगे 4 जून को. ऐसा लग रहा है कि शायद आज ही थक जाए, लेकिन वो बाइट सुन लेते हैं एक बारी.
4 जून जैसा आपने कहा, जिस दिन चुनाव का नतीजा आएगा, आप उस हफ्ते भर में देखना कि यानी भारत का स्टॉक मार्केट के लिए उसके सारे जो उनके प्रोग्रामिंग के जो प्रोग्रामिंग वाले सारे उनके थक जाएंगे.
Like I said, maybe if, that kind of frenzy will already be seen today. There are already reports about brokers perhaps asking for higher margins, exchanges telling brokers, please be ready for large volumes. Sanjay ji, my question is that this way of the market being a gauge of what is happening in the elections, what do you think about that? Because उस पर बहुत चर्चा हुई पिछले हफ्ते भी, और फिर मार्केट्स में कितना फिर स्टीम होगा, ये खबर तो अब आ गई है, आज डिस्काउंट हो जाएगा. क्या 4 जून मार्केट्स के लिए थोड़ा बोरिंग होने वाला है आपके मुताबिक?
नहीं, मुझे नहीं लगता कि बोरिंग होने वाला है. आइदर वे एक्साइटिंग होगा. ट्रेडर्स की दुनिया को मैं थोड़ा कम समझता हूं, तो उस पर कोई कमेंट नहीं करूंगा. लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि बाजार ने काफी कुछ प्राइस इन पहले ही कर लिया था. बीच में जो थोड़ी नर्वसनेस हुई, वो डिपेंड करता है कि किसका कलेजा कितना मजबूत है या कमजोर है. मुझे लगता है कि आज कहीं शॉर्ट कवरिंग के लिए भी भागने की जगह मिलेगी कि नहीं मिलेगी. जो कमजोर दिल के FIIs थे, उनका मुझे नहीं पता. जैसा कि आपने देखा होगा, प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने बहुत केयरफुली वर्ड किया खुद को. उन्होंने कहा 1 हफ्ते में, 1 दिन की बात वो नहीं कर रहे हैं. तो इसलिए मुझे नहीं लगता है कि आज या कल का फोकस ही इंपॉर्टेंट है. ऑफ कोर्स इंपॉर्टेंट है, ये एक सिंबॉलिक तरीके से इंपॉर्टेंट दिन है. लेकिन अगले कुछ दिन आपको ये बताएंगे कि शेयर बाजार का डायरेक्शन क्या रहने वाला है, और वो डायरेक्शन एक ही रहने वाला है, अपवर्ड.
Let's shift a little bit of focus to GDP. And Taimur, it would be unfair if I didn't have a conversation with you around GDP data and what that means for real economy, for India Inc. But firstly, what we've picked up is private consumption continues to remain subdued. Rural economy is also soft, but the headline number has beaten the most optimistic street expectations in terms of Q4 GDP reading. Do you feel like the strong trajectory of growth will continue, especially hoping that the exit polls reflect exactly what happens tomorrow?
Well, I think, like many of our peers, we continue to struggle with India's GDP data. There seems to be, either the way the methodology has changed or the way various statistical quirks work, that we increasingly find it difficult to reconcile high-frequency data with the top-line GDP numbers. So I'll keep the 8% number aside for the time being. I think the general characterization of the economy, I think, was very nicely summarized by you, that we do have some traction on the investment side. Public sector remains a big supporter of investment and expenditure that is supporting consumption, but overall top-line consumption could be better. When we look at listed companies' earnings numbers or sales figures, they don't seem to suggest an economy that is growing by breakneck speed. It's growing, but much more modest than some of the top-line number from national accounts would suggest. So I think that disconnect notwithstanding, it is unquestionable that the market is in a good stage, supported by strong sentiments, and the investment picture, both concurrent as well as prospective, are rather bright.
Taimur, S&P Outlook upgrade coming in on India just a few days ago. A week before that, the RBI bonanza to the central government. A strong GDP reading like we've seen it. Policy continuity. I don't know what's not working for Indian debt. Do you feel like the 10-year could be headed all the way down to 6.5, which makes Indian fixed income a very attractive source, not just for foreigners, but even local retail investors in India can invest into Indian paper? Or should invest, rather?
Right. I think that from a portfolio choice perspective, clearly the equities look, the better risk reward than the fixed income side. But if I am a fixed income house and I am sort of mandated to invest in fixed income and I'm looking at the global fixed income space, certainly the rupee government yield look attractive from a risk reward perspective. I do have concerns about the debt trajectory, which can be resolved through higher GDP growth. And that's the way it was, say, about 15 years ago in India, when the government did have large fiscal deficit, but debt GDP was not an issue because the underlying nominal GDP expansion was rapid. So if we're heading to that sort of trajectory, somewhat accommodating fiscal stance and somewhat higher fiscal expenditure outlays should be absorbable by the economy's buoyancy.
Taimur, in terms of FII direction, was curious to know your view, because that's the big thing that everyone's going to watch today. There were short positions and substantial short positions built. The whole narrative for the last 6 months has been that FIIs are waiting for June 4th before taking a call, and they've been underweight India so far, at least on the equity side of things. Do you see that changing post June 4th?
Right. I think that FIIs are not only waiting for domestic cues, but also global cues. Of course, any sort of interest rate cut by the Fed would be a very powerful signal for the next wave of where money goes. It's very easy these days to just park your money in US dollar debt and US equities, because both have been giving such strong returns, which puts emerging markets, even in the bright spots like India, at a disadvantage. I think India's saving grace is that domestic flows are so strong toward the equity market and increasingly so toward the debt market that the over-reliance on external flows has sort of come down substantially. And I think that's a really, really positive development. Think about 2022, when global EM space was completely unloved and there was virtually no investment. In fact, there was a huge amount of capital withdrawal from global equity space. Indian markets rallied because domestic investors were putting in a lot of money. So I think those days of us, sort of waiting for cues from global investors as a source of bullishness or bearishness on India, I think that's behind us.
That's the quote of the day, huh?
Yeah, in some sense, most certainly. And Taimur, very well put. So thank you so much for, it's great to hear somebody who looks at all the markets kind of bring that point out so well too. So that is very, very appreciative. I have one final question to Sanjay ji. Sanjay ji, from a government formation perspective, key posts, etc., is there something that you are watching out for? Assuming, of course, that tomorrow the incumbent government comes back to power, so on and so forth. Is there something out there that you are keenly watching out for?
Short answer, the way entire Indian politics has now been crafted, These were the conventional ways we would look at who will be the minister and all that. These things have kind of not remained anymore that relevant. And it is all about Mr. Modi's persona, how he navigates, how he crafts his team. He is very careful in choosing people who can execute well and deliver well. So he's going to be very focused on that. And because we are working in a democratic setup, the wide representation of people's aspiration is the core filter that Prime Minister Modi uses for his cabinet formation. But it is no more of a great curiosity that who will be the individual finding various ministries.
Individual doesn't matter, but are we going to possibly see a weekend swearing in, Sanjay ji? 8th and 9th की बात चल रही है.
Can't really pinpoint a date, but it has to be around that time because Prime Minister has to prepare and leave for G7 in Italy on 13th. It begins, so it has to be before 12th, maybe between 8th and 10th. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sanjay Pugalia there, Taimur Baig, setting the stage for what is going to be a very, very exciting morning.